Frost clung to the gravel shoulder as dawn lifted over Highway 83, where a county plow driver noticed a glove half buried in snow, its fibers stiff, the ground unnaturally disturbed, and a silence settled while he waited, breath fogging, for patrol lights to arrive against the North Dakota morning. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The location sat several miles south of Minot, a stretch of roadway bordered by shelter belts and open fields that in December looked emptied of movement and sound. North Dakota winters had a way of flattening time, muting color, preserving whatever they touched. When deputies arrived, they marked the snow, noted the tire impressions leading away from the shoulder, and photographed the glove before anything else was disturbed. Nearby, beneath a shallow drift, the outline of a human form became evident. The woman was later identified as 22-year-old Emily Larson, a nursing student home for the holidays, last seen 3 days earlier after leaving a Thanksgiving weekend gathering. Her disappearance had been reported when she failed to return to her apartment near campus, her car still parked outside, Christmas lights blinking uselessly in her window. Emily Larson had grown up in Ward County, the kind of upbringing familiar to many in the region: long winters, church calendars, summer work, and expectations of steady responsibility. By 1991, she was nearing graduation, balancing part-time work at a care facility with clinical rotations. She had driven home that weekend to help her parents prepare for the early December cold, putting away equipment, checking heaters, and sharing meals that marked the transition from Thanksgiving to the long run toward Christmas. According to family and friends, she planned to return to Minot the following Monday morning. She never arrived. The discovery along Highway 83 triggered a methodical response shaped by experience and limited resources. The body was photographed in situ, the surrounding area cordoned off with tape that snapped in the wind. Investigators documented the frozen ground, the absence of fresh footprints beyond the tire impressions, and the position of Emily's belongings. There were no signs of struggle visible at the surface, no dramatic indicators, only quiet inconsistencies that suggested movement after death. Weather conditions were logged carefully, including overnight lows and recent snowfall, details that would later matter when reconstructing the timeline. The autopsy, conducted later that day in Bismarck due to limited local facilities, established that Emily had been dead approximately 48 to 72 hours. Hypothermia was ruled out as a primary cause. The medical examiner noted blunt force trauma consistent with an assault, though the injuries were not outwardly obvious. There were no defensive wounds apparent on the hands, an absence that raised early questions about whether she had known her attacker or been incapacitated quickly. Toxicology tests were ordered. Fingernail scrapings were collected. Clothing fibers were preserved. Every step followed established procedure, the kind of careful work that rarely made headlines but formed the backbone of cold case resolutions decades later. In the days following the discovery, Minot Daily News ran restrained coverage. Headlines avoided speculation, focusing on confirmed facts and official statements. A photograph of Emily, taken from her college ID, appeared beside appeals for information. Missing person flyers that had only recently gone up were quietly taken down, replaced by notices of a memorial service scheduled for mid-December, just days before Christmas. The timing weighed heavily on the community. Lights went up along Main Street, while law enforcement continued interviews behind closed doors. Investigators reconstructed Emily's last known movements. On Saturday evening, she had attended a small gathering at a friend's apartment in Minot, a pre-holiday dinner that marked the end of Thanksgiving weekend. Witnesses placed her leaving alone around 9:30 p.m., intending to drive back to her parents' home south of town. Her route would have taken her along Highway 83. Her car, however, never left the apartment complex. Keys were found inside her coat pocket. The absence of the vehicle suggested she had not driven that night, raising the possibility that she had accepted a ride or been intercepted before reaching her car. Interviews extended to classmates, coworkers, and neighbors. Police reviewed phone records, limited though they were in 1991, and checked local bars and convenience stores along her likely path. No one recalled seeing Emily after she left the gathering. Snowfall the following night erased many potential traces, turning the open fields into blank pages. What remained were fragments: a glove not matching the rest of her clothing, tire impressions of a light truck, and a partial shoe print inconsistent with Emily's footwear. As December progressed, the case slowed. Leads came in, many prompted by the seasonal atmosphere. Someone reported a suspicious truck seen idling near a church parking lot on Christmas Eve. Another caller mentioned a local man who had been drinking heavily since Thanksgiving, speaking vaguely about an accident. Each tip was logged, checked, and in most cases dismissed. The absence of forensic databases meant comparisons were manual, time-consuming, and often inconclusive. DNA analysis existed but was limited and expensive, not routinely applied in regional cases unless evidence was clear and funding approved. By New Year's Day 1992, the investigation entered a quieter phase. Emily Larson's file moved from active desk to storage cabinet, though detectives continued periodic reviews. Evidence was boxed, labeled, and placed in a cold room that mirrored the environment outside. Over the years, officers retired, memories faded, and the case became one of many unsolved files referenced during training sessions as an example of thorough initial work hindered by circumstance rather than neglect. The community aged alongside the case. Minot expanded, traffic increased along Highway 83, and the stretch of road where Emily was found became easier to miss amid development. Each Thanksgiving and Christmas, her family marked the season privately, declining media attention, maintaining faith that the truth had not been lost. They attended annual meetings with investigators, listening as the same facts were reviewed, the same uncertainties acknowledged. It was a ritual defined by patience and restraint. In 2009, advances in forensic technology prompted the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation to audit older cases with preserved biological evidence. Emily Larson's file was flagged due to the presence of fingernail scrapings and clothing fibers. Funding was secured to submit samples for modern DNA testing. The results, returned months later, identified a male profile previously unknown to law enforcement databases. At the time, it offered promise but no immediate answer. The break came in 2018, following a routine arrest in Montana for an unrelated offense. The suspect, a long-haul truck driver named Daniel Reeve, then in his late 50s, provided a DNA sample as part of booking procedures tied to a federal database expansion. The profile matched the unknown male DNA from Emily Larson's case. Investigators confirmed that Reeve had lived in Minot in 1991 and owned a light truck matching the tire impressions documented at the scene. A review of old employment records showed Reeve had worked temporary construction jobs near the Larson family property during the fall of 1991. Phone records, limited but retrievable through archived billing statements, placed calls between Reeve and a payphone near Emily's apartment complex days before her death. Witnesses re-interviewed after decades recalled seeing Emily speaking with a man near her building that Saturday night, a memory previously dismissed as unreliable but now carrying new weight. Reeve was arrested without incident in early December, nearly 27 years after Emily's death. The timing was not lost on those involved. He was extradited to North Dakota, where he faced charges supported by DNA evidence, corroborated timelines, and documented opportunity. In court, proceedings remained controlled and factual. There were no dramatic confessions, only the slow presentation of records, expert testimony, and preserved evidence finally given voice. In 2020, Daniel Reeve was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The ruling closed one of North Dakota's longest-running cold cases. Emily Larson's family issued a brief statement expressing gratitude to investigators and asking for privacy. The memorial along Highway 83, modest and weathered, was refreshed quietly before Christmas. Snow fell again as it always did, but this time the season carried an ending, measured and lawful, finally allowing the case to rest. After the conviction, attention returned to the long path that had led investigators there, a path defined less by sudden insight than by steady preservation. In 1991, evidence handling in rural North Dakota relied on discipline rather than technology. Each item recovered near Highway 83 had been logged, photographed, sealed, and stored according to procedures that had not changed much since the 1970s. At the time, few imagined that those boxes would sit untouched through multiple administrations, winters, and budget cycles, waiting for methods not yet invented. The survival of Emily Larson's case depended on that patience. During the early years, detectives revisited the timeline repeatedly. They reviewed snowfall records to estimate when tire impressions could have been made, cross-referencing county maintenance logs to determine plowing schedules. They reconstructed Emily's movements hour by hour, narrowing windows and discarding assumptions. The conclusion that she had not driven her own car that night remained central. It suggested an interaction close to her apartment complex, an encounter brief enough to avoid notice, and a vehicle capable of transporting her body without attracting attention. In 1991 Minot, light trucks were common, blending easily into the background of rural traffic. Witness interviews from that period reflected the limitations of memory under routine conditions. No one recalled raised voices or signs of distress. The gathering Emily attended was small and uneventful, remembered primarily because of what followed. Her absence at work the next morning initially suggested a simple delay, perhaps weather-related. Only when she failed to answer calls did concern escalate. That delay mattered. By the time, law enforcement treated the situation as urgent. Weather had already begun erasing transient evidence. Media coverage in the early 1990s remained restrained. The Minot Daily News published updates when new facts emerged, but avoided speculation, reflecting community standards of the time. There were no 24-hour news cycles, no social media amplification. Tips arrived by phone, handwritten notes, or quiet conversations at the sheriff's office. Each was logged in a binder that grew thicker as years passed. Some tips were revisited multiple times, their relevance changing as new information emerged. Emily's autopsy report became one of the most studied documents in the file. Investigators consulted outside experts to interpret injuries within the context of exposure and time. The conclusion that she had been assaulted elsewhere and moved post-mortem shaped search efforts during the first winter. Crews examined nearby properties, drainage ditches, and abandoned structures along Highway 83, finding nothing conclusive. The absence of obvious blood evidence suggested a controlled environment, reinforcing theories about a vehicle or enclosed space. As years turned into decades, the case transitioned formally into cold status, though it never fully disappeared. New detectives inherited the file, often encountering it during winter months when older cases were reviewed. Each transfer risked loss of nuance, but careful documentation preserved core findings. The Larson family remained engaged, attending briefings and providing updated contact information. Their consistency kept the case visible within the department. The introduction of DNA analysis in the late 1990s brought cautious optimism. Early tests were limited and costly, and the partial profile extracted from Emily's fingernail scrapings did not immediately match known offenders. Still, the decision to preserve samples rather than exhaust them reflected foresight. Evidence was repackaged using improved materials, a quiet but critical step that prevented degradation. By the mid-2000s, national attention to cold cases increased, driven by technological advances and federal grants. North Dakota participated selectively, prioritizing cases with preserved biological evidence and clear documentation. Emily Larson's case met those criteria. When her DNA profile was entered into expanded databases, investigators understood that a match could take years, dependent on unrelated arrests and voluntary submissions. It was a waiting process measured in probabilities rather than deadlines. Daniel Reeves' life during that period appeared unremarkable. Records showed transient employment, frequent moves, and minor legal issues that never rose to felony level. He avoided long-term community ties, a pattern common among seasonal laborers. Nothing in his background suggested a connection to Emily Larson until the DNA match forced a retrospective alignment of facts. Once identified, his movements in 1991 were reconstructed using employment records, pay stubs, and testimony from former coworkers, some of whom barely remembered him. Investigators approached the renewed inquiry with caution, aware of the scrutiny that cold case prosecutions attract. They verified chain of custody for every piece of evidence, anticipating defense challenges. Independent laboratories confirmed DNA results. Analysts reviewed the original scene photographs, noting details overlooked at the time, including subtle tire tread characteristics consistent with Reeves' truck model. What once seemed generic gained specificity under modern analysis. Re-interviewing witnesses after nearly 3 decades required sensitivity. Memories had faded, but some details persisted, particularly those tied to emotion rather than routine. One neighbor recalled seeing Emily speaking with a man near the apartment complex, a memory sharpened by later guilt at not reporting it sooner. Investigators corroborated that account with lighting studies and sightline analysis, demonstrating that the observation was plausible given conditions that night. Legal proceedings unfolded deliberately. Prosecutors emphasized evidence rather than narrative flourish, mindful of the audience and the age of the case. The courtroom atmosphere reflected restraint. Many jurors were of an age to remember 1991, to recall the pace of life before digital saturation. The seasonal timing of the trial, beginning in late November, added a subdued gravity as holiday decorations appeared outside the courthouse. The verdict brought measured reactions. There were no public celebrations, only quiet acknowledgement that a long uncertainty had ended. For the Larson family, closure came in fragments rather than a single moment. They attended sentencing, listened to the formal language of the judgment, and returned home to a season still marked by absence. Christmas arrived as it always had, but without the unresolved question that had lingered for decades. In the aftermath, law enforcement conducted an internal review, identifying factors that contributed to the eventual resolution. Preservation, documentation, and willingness to revisit assumptions emerged as themes. The case became a reference point in training sessions, illustrating that resolution often depends on decisions made early, even when immediate results are not visible. Emily Larson's name gradually shifted from headline to record, from active investigation to closed file. The memorial along Highway 83 remained modest, visited occasionally by those who remembered. Traffic continued, seasons cycled, and the landscape changed. The case's resolution did not restore what was lost, but it affirmed a principle familiar to those who had followed it for years: that patience, methodical work, and respect for process can carry answers forward, even through decades of winter. With the legal outcome settled, investigators turned to documenting the full chronology for archival purposes, ensuring that future reviews would understand how each piece aligned. Emily Larson's final weekend was reconstructed with precision that had not been possible in 1991. Bank records showed no unusual withdrawals. Her schedule placed her apartment gathering as the last confirmed social contact. Weather logs confirmed a light snowfall beginning just after midnight, consistent with the preservation patterns observed at the roadside location. These details, once scattered, now formed a coherent sequence. The question of opportunity became central in post-conviction analysis. Daniel Reeves' access to the apartment complex was supported by witness recollections and employment proximity. Construction projects near campus had brought transient workers into areas they would not normally frequent. Reeves' truck, registered in Ward County at the time, was identified through Archive Department of Motor Vehicles records. The tread pattern photographed in 1991, initially noted as generic, was matched through manufacturer archives to a limited production run. This specificity reduced alternative explanations and strengthened the evidentiary chain. Investigators also revisited the decision points made during the initial response. The choice to treat Emily's disappearance seriously within 48 hours, despite early assumptions about weather delays, preserved critical time. The decision to search along Highway 83, informed by her known route and family property location, proved decisive. Even the seemingly minor act of photographing a glove before disturbance became significant when fibers were later analyzed, linking it to materials found in Reeves' vehicle decades later. The autopsy findings were re-examined with contemporary forensic insight. Subtle indicators of restraint, not fully appreciated at the time, were consistent with controlled movement rather than chaotic assault. The absence of extensive external injury aligned with the conclusion that Emily had been subdued quickly, likely through surprise. These interpretations were presented during trial through expert testimony, translating technical findings into understandable conclusions without exaggeration. Community response to the case's resolution reflected North Dakota's character. There were letters to the editor expressing relief and gratitude, written in measured tones. Local radio covered the verdict briefly, focusing on facts rather than emotion. For many residents, the case resurfaced memories of a quieter era, when news traveled slowly and trust in institutions remained largely intact. The resolution reaffirmed that trust, demonstrating continuity between past and present law enforcement efforts. For the Larson family, closure involved practical decisions. They chose to donate Emily's personal papers to a local historical archive, ensuring her life was remembered beyond the circumstances of her death. They worked with investigators to review the case file one final time, asking questions that had lingered for years. The answers, while sometimes painful, replaced uncertainty with clarity. That clarity allowed grief to settle into a different form, one less dominated by unanswered questions. Daniel Reeves' sentencing marked the end of his public presence in the case. He was transferred to a state correctional facility where he would likely spend the remainder of his life. Records indicated no appeal that challenged the substance of the evidence, only procedural aspects that were ultimately denied. The legal process concluded quietly, consistent with the tone maintained throughout. In the years following, the case influenced policy decisions within the state. Evidence storage protocols were updated, emphasizing long-term preservation. Cold case units received modest increases in funding, justified by demonstrable results rather than speculative promises. Training emphasized documentation, recognizing that today's routine work could become tomorrow's critical link. The seasonal context of the case remained inseparable from its narrative. Thanksgiving marked the beginning of Emily Larson's final journey, Christmas framed the community's mourning, and New Year symbolized the passage into uncertainty that lasted decades. When the arrest occurred in December, the symmetry was noted privately among investigators, not as symbolism, but as a reminder of time's persistence. Winter had both concealed and preserved the truth. Local landmarks associated with the case changed over time. The apartment complex was renovated, the road widened, the fields reshaped by development. Yet maps in the case file retained original coordinates, preserving the landscape as it was. These maps served as historical documents, illustrating how investigations are rooted in physical space that evolves even as records remain static. The case also highlighted the role of restraint in storytelling. Investigators resisted sensational narratives, focusing instead on verifiable facts. This approach proved effective in court and in public understanding. By avoiding speculation, the case maintained credibility, allowing evidence to speak across decades. Emily Larson's story became part of institutional memory, referenced in seminars and discussions about cold case methodology. Her name was spoken with respect, not as an abstraction but as a reminder of individual impact. The emphasis remained on process, on the accumulation of small, correct decisions rather than dramatic breakthroughs. As years passed after the verdict, the case receded from active discussion. Annual reports listed it as closed, resolved through DNA evidence and corroborated investigation. For newer residents, it became a historical footnote. For those who remembered 1991, it remained a testament to endurance. Each December, as snow returned to Highway 83, the site of discovery blended again into the landscape. There were no markers visible from the road, no signs to draw attention. Yet the knowledge of what had been uncovered there persisted among those who had worked the case. It served as a quiet reminder that even in the most unassuming places, history leaves traces, waiting for the moment when patience, science, and persistence converge to reveal them. The fourth phase of review focused on institutional memory, the quiet transmission of knowledge across years that rarely appears in official summaries. Investigators who worked the Emily Larson case in its early stages were interviewed after retirement, their recollections recorded to supplement written files. These sessions did not introduce new evidence, but they clarified intent behind decisions made under pressure, explaining why certain leads were prioritized and others deferred. This context proved valuable for training, illustrating how judgment operates when information is incomplete and time is unforgiving. The seasonal environment continued to shape interpretations. North Dakota winters impose practical limits on search operations, dictating when ground can be disturbed and when it must remain untouched. In 1991, frozen soil restricted excavation, a factor documented in reports that later explained why some areas were only examined superficially. When those same areas were revisited decades later during warmer months, nothing remained to be found, but the explanation preserved confidence that opportunities had not been ignored. Emily Larson's case also prompted examination of interagency cooperation. At the time of her death, communication between county sheriffs, state investigators and federal databases was slower and less integrated. Requests moved by mail or fax, responses measured in weeks. By the time DNA technology matured, those systems had improved, allowing older cases to benefit retroactively. The contrast highlighted how structural evolution can alter outcomes without changing the underlying facts. Public perception shifted subtly after the conviction. Community members who had lived with uncertainty for years expressed relief that restraint had been rewarded. There was acknowledgement that the absence of sensational coverage may have prolonged resolution by limiting tips, but there was also recognition that accuracy preserved credibility. In retrospect, the case demonstrated that methodical documentation can outlast attention spans and still deliver results. The role of archives emerged as a central theme. Evidence storage rooms, often overlooked, became symbols of continuity. Temperature-controlled environments, standardized labeling, and redundant inventories ensured that materials collected in 1991 remained viable. These practices were not dramatic, but they were decisive. The Larson case reinforced the argument that investment in preservation yields returns measured not in speed but in certainty. Academic interest followed quietly. Criminology programs referenced the case in discussions about cold case solvability, focusing on factors such as evidence type, documentation quality, and jurisdictional stability. Emily Larson's file illustrated that cases involving stranger perpetrators, once considered less solvable, could still reach resolution when biological evidence was preserved. This reframing influenced how agencies evaluated which cold cases merited renewed attention. The investigation's restraint extended to language. Reports avoided emotive descriptors, adhering to clinical terminology. This consistency reduced ambiguity when documents were reviewed years later. Words chosen in 1991 aligned with definitions still in use decades later, minimizing reinterpretation errors. It was an unintentional advantage of conservative reporting styles common in the region at the time. Family advocacy remained measured throughout. The Larson family declined to engage in public campaigns, instead maintaining regular contact with investigators. This approach fostered trust and reduced pressure to pursue speculative leads. When DNA testing became available, their cooperation facilitated consent procedures and sample comparisons. Their patience mirrored the investigative approach, reinforcing a shared commitment to accuracy. The case also highlighted limits. Some questions remained unanswered, such as the precise sequence of events between Emily's last sighting and the assault. Investigators acknowledged these gaps openly, emphasizing that legal resolution does not equate to narrative completeness. This acknowledgement preserved integrity, resisting the temptation to fill silence with assumption. Environmental reconstruction played a role in trial preparation. Experts recreated lighting conditions near the apartment complex as they existed in 1991, accounting for street lamp placement and seasonal darkness. These reconstructions supported witness credibility without overstating certainty. The emphasis remained on plausibility rather than dramatization. Daniel Reeves' background was examined carefully, not to construct a psychological profile, but to establish opportunity and presence. His transient lifestyle complicated tracking, but employment records and housing applications provided anchors. These documents, mundane in nature, proved as critical as forensic evidence, illustrating how ordinary records can accumulate significance over time. Post-conviction, law enforcement agencies conducted outreach to explain the process to the public. Presentations emphasize that cold casework is incremental, often dependent on external developments. The Larson case served as an example of patience rewarded, countering perceptions that unresolved cases reflect neglect. Emily Larson's memory was integrated into community history in subtle ways. Scholarships established in her name supported nursing students, linking her aspirations to future generations. These initiatives were not publicized widely, reflecting the family's preference for quiet remembrance. They ensured that her identity extended beyond the circumstances of her death. The broader impact on policy was incremental. Evidence retention periods were extended. Funding for forensic testing was allocated with long-term horizons. Training modules incorporated lessons from the case, stressing that initial thoroughness can compensate for future uncertainty. As investigators reflected, they noted that the case's resolution did not hinge on a single breakthrough, but on accumulation. Each correct step, however small, contributed to a foundation strong enough to support prosecution decades later. This perspective reshaped how success was defined within departments, valuing endurance alongside efficiency. The seasonal framing returned repeatedly in reflection. Thanksgiving initiated concern, Christmas marked loss, New Year ushered in uncertainty, and a December arrest closed the circle. These markers structured memory, providing reference points that anchored the abstract passage of time. In closing analyses, Emily Larson's case was cited as evidence that justice can operate on extended timelines without compromising legality. The lawful identification of Daniel Reeve, supported by verifiable evidence and due process, demonstrated that age does not diminish accountability. The quiet aftermath that followed underscored that resolution is often less dramatic than imagined, defined instead by documentation, acceptance, and the steady continuation of life in a community that remembers without spectacle. The final stage of the Emily Larson case settled into routine record-keeping, the understated conclusion that follows a lawful resolution. Once appeals were exhausted, the file was formally closed, stamped, and transferred to permanent archives. Digital copies were created, indexed, and cross-referenced so that the investigation could be studied without disturbing original materials. What had once been an active mystery became a documented history, its movement frozen in paper and data much like the winter landscape that first preserved its evidence. For those who had worked the case across decades, closure brought neither celebration nor relief so much as quiet affirmation. The outcome validated long hours spent reviewing notes, preserving samples, and resisting the urge to declare defeat. Detectives spoke of the case in professional terms, emphasizing process over emotion. Yet beneath that restraint was acknowledgement that patience had meaning, that careful work could outlast time itself. Emily Larson's parents marked the conclusion privately. They visited the roadside one last time together, not as an act of mourning but as a gesture of release. The snow was light that day, the sky flat and gray, typical of early winter in North Dakota. There were no reporters, no statements issued. The moment passed unnoticed by anyone else, which was how they preferred it. Afterward, they returned home and began the slower work of reorganizing memories no longer overshadowed by uncertainty. In Minot, the case faded from daily conversation. New residents knew little of it unless they sought it out in archives or old newspaper microfilm. For longtime locals, it remained a reference point, recalled occasionally during winter storms or discussions of how the town had changed. The resolution confirmed a shared belief that even in small communities, accountability could reach across decades. Law enforcement agencies continued to cite the case internally. Training manuals included anonymized excerpts, highlighting decision-making rather than outcome. The lesson emphasized was simple: treat every scene as if it will be revisited years later, preserve evidence, write clearly, avoid assumptions. These principles, reinforced by Emily Larson's case, shaped how future investigations were conducted. The courthouse where Daniel Reeve was sentenced returned to its normal rhythm. Holiday decorations came down, replaced by routine dockets and procedural hearings. Clerks filed transcripts, judges moved on to new cases, and the building resumed its quiet role as an instrument rather than a symbol. The law had functioned as intended, without spectacle, without deviation. Daniel Reeve himself disappeared into the correctional system, his name appearing only in administrative records. He did not grant interviews, did not issue statements. His life became defined by schedules and restrictions far removed from the roads and construction sites that once allowed him anonymity. For the legal system, his conviction represented accountability achieved through evidence rather than confession, a reminder that proof, not narrative, governs outcomes. The physical evidence associated with the case was reviewed one final time. Items not required for ongoing legal purposes were retained according to policy, others prepared for eventual disposal decades in the future. Each decision was logged. Even in closure, procedure mattered. Nothing was discarded impulsively. The case had taught that time can change the value of what appears insignificant. Emily Larson's name appeared periodically in academic literature, cited in discussions of cold case resolution rates and forensic preservation. These references were factual, stripped of personal detail, but they ensured that her case contributed to broader understanding. In this way, her death informed improvements that might benefit others, an indirect legacy rooted in prevention rather than remembrance. Seasonal markers continued to frame how those closest to the case remembered it. Thanksgiving still carried weight, though less sharply than before. Christmas no longer symbolized unanswered loss, but reflection. New Year's Eve, once a reminder of another year without answers, became simply a transition. Time did not erase grief, but it rebalanced it. The landscape along Highway 83 changed incrementally. Traffic increased, signage shifted, and the shoulder where Emily was found blended further into routine infrastructure. Snow still accumulated there each winter, plows still passed before dawn, and drivers still traveled the route unaware of its history. The absence of a marker was intentional, respecting the family's wishes. Memory existed in records and minds, not monuments. The case demonstrated how rural investigations rely on steadiness rather than volume. There were no task forces numbering in the hundreds, no flood of external attention. Progress came from continuity, from the same institutions maintaining responsibility across generations. This continuity proved sufficient. In the final analysis prepared by the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the case was summarized in neutral language. Dates, actions, and outcomes were listed without embellishment. The conclusion noted that advances in DNA technology enabled identification of the offender, supported by corroborating evidence and lawful procedure. It was an ending defined by clarity. For investigators nearing retirement, Emily Larson's case occupied a particular place among their experiences. It was neither the most complex nor the most public, but it embodied the reason they had stayed. It affirmed that unresolved cases are not failures but obligations carried forward until circumstances allow resolution. The quiet aftermath extended beyond institutions. Life in Minot continued with its familiar rhythms: school calendars, winter maintenance, local elections, seasonal routines. The community absorbed the resolution without disruption. The case did not redefine the town, but it reinforced a sense of continuity between past and present. Emily Larson's story concluded not with dramatic revelation, but with documentation, accountability, and acceptance. The legal system functioned as designed, delayed but not denied. The investigation honored facts over speculation, restraint over noise. In that restraint lay its strength. Decades after a glove lay half buried in snow, the truth it hinted at was fully revealed. Not through sudden insight, but through preservation, patience, and methodical work. The case closed quietly, leaving behind records rather than echoes, and a community that moved forward knowing that even the longest winters eventually give way to resolution.